Life in the small town went on as usual, although the war, which until then seemed distant, was approaching with ever heavier steps. People tried to pretend that everything was normal, that the growing fear was just a passing shadow, a threat that might not reach them. But deep down, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. It was in this uncertain setting that Alexander and Sophia met, and, ironically, it was also in the midst of the impending war that they discovered the purest, truest, and most intense love they could ever imagine. Alexander was the son of a railroad worker, a simple, hard-working boy with calloused hands, accustomed to the weight of tools and the smell of iron and oil. He grew up among tracks, trains, and dreams that, until that moment, seemed possible, despite everything. Sophia, in turn, was the daughter of a tailor. She possessed a delicate beauty, one that can't be explained solely by her appearance, but by her smile, her gaze, her way of speaking. Her eyes had the depth of someone with an ancestral soul, and her smile was capable of brightening even the greyest days of that town forgotten by the world. Their meeting was, as they say, a coincidence, but who believes in coincidence in love? It was a cold morning in early autumn at the city fair. Sophia hurriedly dropped the apples she had bought from the bag. One of them rolled to Alexander's feet, and without thinking, he bent down, picked up the fruit, and, looking up, met her gaze. That seemingly simple moment would change the course of two lives forever. There was a silence that seemed to stop time. They looked at each other as if they had known each other from other lives, as if that moment was simply the reunion of something that had always existed. And from that day on, there were no more mornings or afternoons without their paths. Somehow, crossing first by chance, then by choice, their encounters became more frequent. They walked together along the cobblestone streets, chatted for hours in the central square, and exchanged knowing glances at the church door on Sundays. Over time, their fingers intertwined, their gazes intensified, and their love, which at first seemed shy, blossomed with a strength that even they could not explain. But a shadow loomed over that love. War. The call could come at any moment, and Alexander knew it. The days that should have been bright, full of plans and dreams, also carried the weight of fear, uncertainty, and the possibility of goodbye. Even so, they decided to live every second as if it were their last. They went to the lake where they had played as children, made promises under the old oak tree at the top of the hill, dreamed together of a little house, of children running around in the garden, of a simple but loving life. And in every word, there was a mixture of hope and despair, like someone trying to grasp time in their hands, knowing it was slipping away like sand. One of those afternoons, sitting at the edge of the tracks where Alexander worked with his father, he took Sophia's hand and, looking into her eyes, said softly, almost in a whisper, "I don't know what will happen, but if I don't come back, I want you to know that you were, are, and always will be, the love of my life." Sophia squeezed his hand tightly, feeling the tears threatening to spill over, but she didn't want to cry. Not there, not in that moment that should have been hers alone. She took a deep breath, placed her hand on his face, and replied, "And you, Alex, you are the love of my soul. Neither war, nor time, nor the whole world can change that." That night, as if the universe knew time was running faster than usual, they surrendered to each other. It wasn't a hasty surrender born of fear, but one filled with love, desire, and silent promises. It was as if, in that instant, they could immortalize everything they felt, as if their bodies held the memories that distance would try to erase. Dawn, however, arrived like a breath. The train whistle, which had once represented life, movement, and the future, now seemed like a sentence. The call had come. Alexander was to report to the army that morning. At the station, the scene was heartbreaking. Men in new uniforms, pale faces, eyes filled with fear, and, at the same time, courage. Families weeping, mothers hugging their children, wives holding their husbands' hands, as if that would prevent them from leaving. Sophia was there, wearing a blue dress, and holding a small box. Beside was a photo of them together, and a letter she didn't dare hand over. The letter contained only one sentence: "Come back to me, or take me with you." Seeing her, Alexander ran to her. Time seemed cruel, squeezing every second as if it were about to tear it away. He held her face in both hands, looked into her eyes, now filled with tears, and said, in a broken voice, "Wait for me. Promise." She just shook her head, unable to say a word. Her tears spoke for her. The train whistled. It was time. Alexander kissed her, a kiss that contained all the love, all the pain, all the fear, and all the hope that could fit in two hearts about to be shattered by war. She boarded the train, and as the car began to move, Sophia placed her hand on her stomach, not yet knowing, not even imagining, that inside her, a life was already beginning to beat. The train departed, taking a man with it, taking a love with it, and leaving, unbeknownst to them, the beginning of a new story. The day dawned with a grey and heavy sky, as if even the heavens understood the weight of that day. The sound of the station bells echoed through the town, mingling with the whistle of the trains and the bustle of people who, amid tears and farewells, tried to cling to the last few seconds with their loved ones. Alexander woke up before dawn. He couldn't sleep. His head was spinning, his chest felt tight, and the clock seemed to mock him, ticking faster than ever. Each tick sounded like a nail sinking into the planks of a separation he didn't want, but one that was inevitable. He dressed slowly. The new uniform didn't seem to fit him well. It wasn't a physical discomfort, but a strange feeling, as if, by putting it on, he'd cease to be who he was, and become something he'd never wanted to be, a soldier, not a hero. He'd never seen himself as one, but as someone thrown into a war he didn't choose. As he packed his small suitcase with a few belongings, his gaze fell on the table where there were two photographs, one of his mother, who had died years before, and another, more recent, of him and Sophia. Letters. The memory of that smile sent a pang through his chest. It was a mixture of love, despair, and helplessness. Across town, Sophia hadn't slept a wink either. She spent the night awake, sitting by the window, staring at the stars and wondering how many more nights she'd spend like this, waiting for someone she didn't know would return. Fear was a silent invader that entered through the front door and settled deep within her soul. She was wearing her best dress, the blue one Alexander loved so much. She tied her hair with the ribbon he had given her for her last birthday and held a small wooden box in her hands. Inside, a photo of the two of them and a letter he had started to write so many times but had never dared to finish, not even deliver it. On the paper, scribbled in shaky letters, was a sentence he had written and rewritten countless times. "If I could tell you just one thing, it would be, you're going to be a father, . But the words didn't come out, not that day, and maybe they never would. The station was filled with an air of farewell. Lines of men formed up to check names. Women wept. Mothers hugged their children as if they could avoid the inevitable. Children clung to their parents' hands, not quite understanding what was happening, but sensing that something terrible was about to happen. When Alexander arrived, his gaze immediately sought out Sophia, and there she was, standing next to the wooden bench where they used to sit and talk about life. She held the box against her chest as if it were a shield, a protection from the world that now seemed to want to destroy them. He hurried over, dropped the suitcase on the floor, and cupped her face with both hands, as if trying to memorize every detail with that caress. The scent of her hair, the warmth of her skin, the trembling of her hands. Everything needed to be put away, recorded, because he knew that might be the final touch. "I don't know what's going to happen, Sophia," he said, his voice breaking, "but I swear, with all my heart, that I'll come back, for you, for us." She took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears, but it was no use. Her chest ached, her throat tightened, and she just wanted to scream to the world that this wasn't fair, that he couldn't leave her. "Not now, not like this. I'll wait for you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what happens," she replied, pressing her hand against his face. "I love you, Alexander, and nothing, absolutely nothing, will change that." The train's shrill whistle interrupted what could have been a kiss, a last word, a longer embrace. The moment had arrived. The soldiers began to board the cars. The doors closed slowly, as if to give a few more seconds to the broken hearts that filled the platform. Alexander looked at Sophia one last time. Her gaze said, "It all, don't forget me, wait for me, I love you." And her eyes, filled with tears, answered, "You are everything. Come back to me." She boarded the train, the door closed, and when the car started moving, Sophia ran, following the train as far as her legs would carry her, crying, clutching the box to her chest, as if it were her own heart, desperately trying not to break. As the train turned the corner and disappeared over the horizon, he fell to his knees, powerless. Instinctively, he brought his hands to his stomach. He didn't know it, he didn't understand it yet, but inside him, a life was beginning to beat. A life he'd never known would exist. And at that precise moment, without Alexander being able to imagine it, 3 hearts were separated by war. His, hers, and the heart of the person who, unbeknownst to him, was already part of that love. As the train, carrying Alexander, faded into the distance, Sophia's life seemed to lose its color. The station, once so familiar, now resembled a ghostly scene. People slowly dispersed, some still crying, others silent, as if the air had been knocked out of them. Sophia stood there, motionless, holding the small box to her chest, trying to comprehend how it was possible that, in a matter of minutes, her life had changed forever. The walk home was the longest she'd ever taken. Every street seemed emptier, colder. The shops were open. People were trying to go about their daily lives, but nothing seemed real. Everything had been swallowed up by the emptiness of absence, by the echo of that train whistle, which now was the sound she most feared remembering. When he got home, he collapsed in the chair by the window. He sat there for hours, staring at the horizon, as if he could somehow see beyond, to where Alexander lay. But he saw only the grey sky and the swaying trees, indifferent to his pain. Silence, that oppressive silence, pervaded everything. Before, I had always found joy in the sounds of life, the laughter of children, the hammering of tailors, the whistle of trains. Now, every sound seemed distant, muffled, as if the world had sunk beneath the water. It was a screaming silence, an emptiness that filled everything. The days began to pass strangely. Mornings came without her realizing she'd slept. The nights were long, endless. Each sunset was a cruel reminder that he was far away, and worse, that she didn't know where or how, or if he was okay, or if he was even alive. The routine, which had once seemed to make sense, was now simply a matter of survival. Wake up, make coffee, look out the window, waiting all the time. Every step toward the door, every time someone passed by on the street, made her heart race. What if it was a letter? What if it was news from her? But no, it wasn't. At first, the neighbors tried to comfort her. They brought her bread, flowers, and words that, although well-intentioned, failed to calm the abyss that was opening up inside her. Over time, they realized there was little they could do, and, as often happens when faced with the pain of others, they began to drift away, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts, her memories, and her fears. Nights were the worst, because that's when the outside world fell silent, and only the sound of her own heart pounding in her chest remained. It was in the early morning when she allowed herself to cry endlessly, without shame, without needing to be strong. She cried herself to sleep, often clutching the wooden box, where she kept his photo and that letter, the letter she never delivered. But it was one of those nights when she noticed something different, a sudden nausea, an inexplicable dizziness. At first, she thought it was just nervousness, anxiety, maybe pent-up sadness. After all, her body, like her soul, was in pieces. But the following days brought signs she could no longer ignore. The absence of her period, the extreme fatigue, her different body. Something inside her whispered of a possibility that simultaneously frightened her and filled her with hope. And so it was, one grey morning, when she plucked up the courage to go see the only midwife in town. The journey seemed longer than any other. Her heart was pounding, her hands were shaking, and deep down, she already knew it. She already felt it. The confirmation came quickly, almost like a punch and a hug at the same time. "Sophia, you're expecting a child." The words seemed to echo in the room, filling all the space, all the emptiness, all the absence. It was as if life began to beat again inside him, but with it came fear. A fear so great it seemed to crush his lungs, making it impossible for him to breathe. So what now? How do you tell him? How do you raise a child alone, in the middle of a war? And, worse yet, what if he never came back? What if he never found out? Returning home, clutching her stomach with her still shaking hands, Sophia looked toward the window, the same window where she spent hours, waiting, and for the first time since Alexander left, a tear fell, not just of pain, but also of love. A love that was now more than a promise, more than a memory. It was a life, a small life that beat inside her. And, Placing his hand on her belly, he whispered, "Your father doesn't know it yet, but you already mean everything to me." Deep in her soul, she felt that the silence that had hurt her so much was now filled with something new, full of hope, full of life. Even if Alexander didn't know it, even if he never knew it, the wind blew colder that morning. The town seemed silent, as if it shared the secret quietly growing inside Sophia. She woke up once again before dawn, as she had been doing for the past few weeks. But this time, it wasn't just the weight of longing that woke her. There was something different, something she, until then, hadn't been able to identify. Her body began to give signs that Sophia tried to ignore. First, extreme fatigue, then, persistent nausea. Into the early hours of the day, a slight dizziness, a sensitivity that made even common kitchen smells almost unbearable. Deep down, she knew it, but her mind refused to accept it. That morning, as she tried to make coffee, she was overcome by such nausea that she had to run to the backyard. Kneeling on the damp earth, hugging herself as if trying to keep the world from collapsing, Sophia burst into tears. It was no longer a mere suspicion. Her body was screaming a truth that her soul, until then, hadn't had the courage to hear. He stood up, washed his face, and looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles. But there was something beyond the tiredness. There was a strange glow, a reflection that he didn't know if it was fear or hope, or both, mixed in a bitter potion that he would now have to drink. For the first time since Alexander had left, she turned away from the window and walked toward the village midwife. She was an older woman, with steady hands and gentle eyes, who had delivered almost every child in the village. The walk seemed longer than ever. Every step seemed to echo inside her, as if every stone on the street, every leaf blown by the wind, was witnessing that moment. As he entered the midwife's house, she could barely speak. He simply held the old woman's hands and let the tears flow. The woman didn't ask anything. He simply smiled, with that silent wisdom that only age brings, and asked Sophia to lie down. The examination was quick. The expert hands gently pressed on the still pronounced belly, while the midwife's gaze scanned the young woman's face, seeking the confirmation she already knew she would find. "You're expecting a child, my girl," he said in a calm voice, almost like a hugging whisper. Life wanted it that way. For a moment, everything fell silent, as if the entire world had stopped. The sound of the wind outside ceased, the birds fell silent, and even Sophia's rapid heartbeat seemed to stop in that instant. Slowly, she placed her hands on her stomach, as if touching something sacred. Tears flowed uncontrollably. She didn't know if she was crying from fear, joy, despair, or all of the above. "Are you sure?" he asked in a halting, almost childlike voice. The midwife shook hands and nodded. "Life always finds a way, my daughter, even in the midst of war. Life insists on flourishing." Sophia walked home slowly, as if she carried not only a body, but also an entire world inside her. Each step felt heavier and more sacred at the same time. The sound of her own feet on the gravel pounded like a drum, marking the beginning of a new journey she wasn't sure she was ready to face. When he got home, he sat back down by the window. He looked at the horizon, the same path that had led Alexander weeks before, and he wondered, for the first time out loud, "What am I going to do now?" The fear was overwhelming. Society looked askance at women who had children out of wedlock. She knew that sharp tongues would soon begin to cut, that judgmental looks would be inevitable. But more than the fear of people, there was the fear of the unknown, the fear of raising a child alone, in the middle of a war, not knowing if her father would ever return. And at the same time, a flame burned, a small flame of love that neither absence, nor distance, nor war could extinguish. A flame that now grew not only in her chest, but also in her belly. Sophia approached the wooden box where she kept Alexander's things. She opened it slowly, as if opening a locket, a sacred temple where all the memories, all the dreams, and all the promises were kept. She took the photo of them together and caressed his face with her fingers, as if she could feel his skin, his scent, his presence. He took out the letter he'd never dared to hand over, the one on which, so many times, he'd written and erased the words, "You're going to be a father." He sat down, took a deep breath, held the pen with trembling hands, and after a few seconds staring at the blank paper, finally wrote, "My love, there's a life growing inside me, a life that's yours, that's ours." But when she finished the sentence, she remained motionless. Tears fell onto the paper, staining the ink. She felt a tightness in her chest, and, like the other times, she didn't have the courage to continue. She folded the paper slowly, put it in the box, closed it, and hugged it as if she were hugging her own broken heart. The fear that Alexander would never find out, the fear that the letter would never arrive, and, at the same time, the hope that, one day, he would be able to hold that child in his arms, the son who didn't even know he existed yet. Time continued to pass. The days dragged slowly by, and with each dawn, the weight of Alexander's absence seemed to grow more unbearable. But now, in addition to the longing, something new was growing inside Sophia, a responsibility, a certainty, and, at the same time, a deep fear she was pregnant, and the future that until then had seemed vague and uncertain now had a shape, a face, a life pulsing within her. At first, it was difficult. Every day, the signs became more evident, more undeniable. Sophia looked in the mirror and saw the change in her body. Her belly began to round out, and she knew that soon she would no longer be able to hide the truth. She wanted the world to know, for Alexander to know, but at the same time, she feared the reaction. How could she tell him? How could she talk about something so important, so unexpected, when the man she loved wasn't there to share that moment? With every step she took, fear invaded her. The fear of being judged, the fear of being alone, the fear of raising a child without the support of the person she always imagined would be by her side. But at the same time, a flame of courage began to grow, a flame that sprang from the depths of her being, where the love she felt for Alexander mingled with the strength of a woman who knew that, even in the face of war, pain, and loneliness, she could face anything, to protect the life she now carried within her. The house seemed smaller every day. The solitude made the walls thinner, and the sounds of the village, once comforting, were now distant, almost as if they couldn't reach her. Sophia felt lost in her thoughts. If she could, she would isolate herself from the world. But there was something holding her back, something that made her get up every morning, look out the window, and gaze at the horizon, hoping, perhaps, that the train bringing Alexander would return, bringing him back to her. But that didn't happen, and time kept passing, relentless. The mornings were the worst. The bitter coffee, the silence, the thoughts that kept running through her mind. Every morning, she wondered if she'd made the right decision, if she'd have the courage to face what was coming. At night, she allowed herself to cry. Sometimes, she didn't know if the tears were of longing, fear, or indescribable pain. She only knew that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she didn't know how to deal with. But there were times when courage emerged timidly, like a gentle breeze turning into a strong wind. She began to imagine the child that was about to be born. What would it be? A boy like Alexander, or a girl with his shining eyes? The idea of raising a child alone terrified her. But at the same time, she felt it was destiny, that this child was there as a reminder of everything she had been through with Alexander. It was her chance to continue their love, to ensure that, somehow, he would never die. In the evenings, when the sun set behind the mountains and the golden light flooded the house, Sophia began to feel a gentle stirring within her. It was like a caress, a whisper from the future that reminded her that life was still there. She allowed herself to smile, albeit timidly, as if the pain of the past was softened by the touch of hope. But as night fell, the fear returned. How would she do it? How would she cope alone? It was impossible not to ask herself this question every day. The fear of being judged, of facing grief without anyone's support. The war seemed to have robbed her of everything in life. She had lost love, the certainty of the future, and now she felt life giving her something back, but at the same time, taking control. There was something incredibly challenging about the idea of raising a child in such dark times, but she knew she had no choice. The child was a part of Alexander, and perhaps that was the only thing she could salvage from all of this. She had to be strong, not for herself, but for the life inside her. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Sophia walked toward the town square. The sound of children playing in the fields in the background seemed distant, but it still filled her with a strange sense of peace. She sat on her usual bench, the same one where Alexander used to wait for her. She placed her hand on her stomach and closed her eyes. At that moment, she felt a presence, something that calmed her. that made her feel she wasn't alone. And for a moment, she saw herself as a different woman. She was no longer the young woman who fell in love at first sight. She was no longer the anxious bride who said goodbye to love. Now she was a mother who, even without knowing what the future held, was willing to face everything with courage. Because, above all, she knew that the love she carried within was stronger than any fear, stronger than pain, stronger than war. And in that moment, she promised herself she would do whatever was necessary to protect that tiny being. That even if Alexander never knew, their love would endure. And the son she never met would be proof that, even in the most painful circumstances, life always finds a way to flourish. The days passed with cruel slowness. Time seemed to drag on, as if it knew that. For Sophia, every minute felt like an eternity. On the wall of the room, the old clock ticked away, but it didn't ease the weight of waiting. The sound of the needle, which had previously been barely perceptible, now seemed a constant reminder of everything she was missing. Sophia's womb no longer concealed the secret it held. Every morning, standing in front of the mirror, she confirmed that a life was growing inside her, even though Alexander, lost somewhere at the front, didn't know it. And that was precisely what devastated her the most. The fact that he didn't know, that he had no idea that even before leaving, he had left there, in that small town, something more than love. He had left a legacy, a son. For the first few days after discovering she was pregnant, Sophia tried to ignore the thought of writing. The truth was too painful, too confusing. But over time, she realized that, somehow, she needed to talk to Alexander. She needed to tell him. Even if she never knew for sure if that letter would arrive. Even if the world, with its insane war, might destroy the words before they reached her hands. He sat down at the table, the same one where they had laughed, talked, and dreamed so many times. He spread the yellowed paper out on it, picked up his pen, and took a deep breath. His heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to burst out of his chest. His hands were trembling. It was as if, in trying to put into words what he was experiencing, he had to accept, once again, that it was all real. "My love," he began. But as soon as she finished writing, she stopped. She stared at those two words for minutes that seemed like hours. Tears began to fall, silently, wetting the paper. I tried to continue. "I don't know how to tell you this. I don't even know if you'll get this letter." But the word remained there, alone, solitary, bearing the weight of everything that came after. The fear, the piety, doubt, the pain, and above all, the lack. She put down her pen, put her hands to her face, and wept. She wept like she hadn't since the day he left. It was a deep, bitter cry that came from the depths of her soul. A cry that said more than any words she could write. After a few minutes, she took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and tried again. "You're going to be a father." The trembling hand drew the letters slowly, as if each curve, each line, were an open scar on the chest. But as soon as he finished that sentence, he stopped again. What could he say next? How could he explain everything he felt? How could he put into words the fear of never seeing that child again? The terror that that boy or girl would grow up without knowing who their father was, without ever feeling the warmth of his arms, the sound of his voice. Sophia closed her eyes, pressed the letter against her chest, and whispered, as if praying, "Come back to me. Please, come back." For days he tried to write. For days, he would sit at the table, stare at the blank paper, and start a new letter, each one different, each one more difficult than the last. First, he started talking about the love he felt. "My love, not a single day goes by that I don't think of you." In another, he spoke of war and fear. "I hope you're well." Here, the town remains silent, waiting for those who have left. And in all of them, I always try to write that phrase. Always, "You're going to be a father." But every time she reached that point, her hands stopped. The words escaped her. The tears returned. It was as if, in writing this, she had to accept a truth that terrified her. The possibility that Alexander would never know. That she would never hold that child in her arms. And then, she began to put away the letters, one by one. All unfinished. All carefully folded, tied with a red ribbon, and stored in the same box as the photos, the handkerchief he'd given her, and the first letter he'd written when he started serving in the army. Every day, the box became more than just a treasure chest of memories. It was a reliquary, a place where she deposited not only her memories, but also her hopes, her fears, and, above all the love she could no longer express. Sometimes I imagined how I would react if I received one of those letters. I would close my eyes and see Alexander opening the envelope with his mud-covered hands, right in the middle of the battlefield. I would see his eyes widen, his mouth tremble, and tears stream down his face as he read, "You're going to be a father." I wondered if he would smile, if he would cry, if he would feel fear, joy, or a cruel mixture of both. And, more than that, I wondered if I would give him strength. If, knowing he had a lifetime ahead of him, Alexander would fight harder to return. But the world was cruel, and deep down, Sophia knew there were no guarantees. None. The letters might never arrive. They might get lost along the way. Or worse, ... They might arrive, but too late. And so, day after day, he wrote, and he didn't send. Because each letter was, in fact, a conversation with him, ... wherever he was. Words that crossed the silence. Words that, although never read, were written with all the love that still existed. To the man she loved. For the son who never knew I existed. Time, which had once seemed to run uncontrollably, had become a cruel and slow tyrant. For Sophia, each day was an unbearable mix of hope and despair. And for Alexander, somewhere beyond the horizon, time also seemed to have lost its meaning. Because war has no clocks. It has silences. Long, heavy, and cruel silences. The first weeks at the front were like a plunge into hell. The smell of gunpowder mixed with mud, the incessant sound of shells, the screams, and, ironically, the silences between attacks. It was in those intervals, when the entire world seemed to hold its breath, that true terror was unleashed. Because in the silence, thought screamed louder. Alexander, like so many other soldiers, constantly wondered if he would survive another day, another night, another offensive. Every shot that whizzed past his head was a cruel reminder that his life hung by a thread, a thin, fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. But even in the midst of absolute chaos, there was something that kept him going, an image, a memory, Sophia's face, the memory of her eyes, the touch of her hands, the scent of her hair. That was what made him get up. Every day, even when his body didn't want to anymore, even when his soul screamed for him to give up, he wrote letters whenever he could. Letters that often took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. And in them, he never spoke of the horrible things he saw. He never described the mud, the blood, the corpses that surrounded him. No, the letters were of hope, of love, of his burning desire to return to her. "My love," he once wrote, "if you only knew how your face saves me every day, how the sound of your voice, which I keep in my memory, keeps me from going mad." I didn't know, I had no idea, but as I poured the words onto paper, Sophia, halfway around the world, held her no-growing belly, reading and rereading those same letters, and wondering how to tell him that, even separated by the war, he was no longer alone, that now there was someone else waiting for him, someone who carried the same blood, the same love. But the silence of war didn't choose sides. It was the same for those on the battlefield and for those waiting on this side. And this silence was a slow killer, corroding everything from within. The news, when it arrived, was confusing and inconsistent. Some men had fallen, others had been captured, and many simply disappeared, without a trace, without answers. Sophia always listened to the words Alexander sent her. But as the months passed, these words became increasingly rare. The letters that used to arrive once a month began to take 2-3 months, until they stopped arriving. The postman, who had once been the hope of every morning, now passed by without even looking at her door, and it was this silence that hurt her the most. The uncertainty, the emptiness, the lack of news that made her imagine terrible scenarios. She wondered if he was hurt, if he was still alive, if he was thinking about her, and if, in some mysterious way, he felt like he'd left behind something more than love. In the village, people also began to fall silent. The look that had once been compassionate was now mixed with shame, because everyone knew. They knew that when the letters stopped arriving, the outcome was almost never good, but no one had the courage to say it. No one wanted to be the messenger of a possible end. Sophia spent hours sitting by the window. Her hands rested on her belly, which no longer concealed the secret it held, and inside her, the child moved, as if somehow sensing his mother's distress, as if saying, "I'm here, I'm part of it, too." The silence of the war was also made up of the dreams Sophia had every night. She dreamed of Alexander. She dreamed of him returning, holding her, touching her face, kissing her belly, smiling at the discovery that he was going to be a father. But when she woke up, the emptiness of the bed next to hers, the cold emanating from his absence, was like a slow, deep, and cruel stab. And yet, she resisted, because, deep down, she knew she couldn't allow herself to fall apart, that it wasn't just her anymore, that there was a life inside her that depended on her strength, her courage, her hope, and that, even if Alexander never knew, even if he never returned, she would forever carry, in every feature of that son, the love they had shared. The silence of war was dense, but their love was stronger than any silence, stronger than distance, stronger even than death. The sky was heavy that day, as if the clouds carried not only the promise of rain, but the entire weight of the world. The wind blew hard, tearing leaves from the trees, slamming doors, carrying with it the smell of wet earth mixed with the smell of distant gunpowder. The war seemed ever closer, as if, at any moment, it might engulf that small village that, until then, had struggled to survive in its own way. Sophia paced back and forth inside the house. Her hands held her belly, which now seemed heavier than ever. The contractions began in the early hours, at first mild and spaced out, but as the hours passed, they became more intense, more frequent, more painful. And with each wave of pain came fear, a fear so overwhelming it felt like it wanted to crush her soul. She was alone. The midwife had left the village 2 days earlier to attend a birth on a distant farm, and now, when she needed her most, no one was there. The nearest neighbors were elderly and frail, and although some had come to offer help, no one quite knew what to do. The sound of planes crossing the sky didn't help. At any moment, bombs could fall, as they had already fallen on the neighboring villages. But inside that simple house, a much bigger battle was being fought. A silent battle, invisible to the outside world. It was the battle for life, for continuity, for hope. Sophia clutched the edge of the bed, panting, sweating, cold. Tears streamed down her face, not only from the physical pain, but from the pain of absence. She looked toward the door, as if, at any moment, Alexander would come in, smiling, running, telling her everything was fine, that he was back, that they were safe now. But there was only silence, the silence of war, the silence of the world, the silence of waiting. With each contraction, she squeezed her eyes shut, bit her lip, and whispered his name, like a prayer, like a desperate plea. Alex, Alex, come back to me, come back. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her body took over. Nature, with its overwhelming force, took over. And then, amid the pain, the fear, and the distant sound of bombs, a scream filled the house. A loud, powerful scream that broke the silence, as if telling the world that, despite everything, despite the war, the pain, and the death, life had triumphed. Sophia hugged that tiny being, trembling, sweaty, exhausted, but filled with a wave of love so intense it seemed capable of healing any wound. She looked at that small face, still wet, still fragile, and saw Alexander's eyes in it, the same shape, the same gaze, as if, somehow, he were there, present. Witnessing this miracle, "Your proof," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Proof that our love wasn't in vain." Her hands, once so shaky, now grew firm, holding that life with a strength she hadn't even known she possessed. Every tiny finger, every line, every movement of that baby was a memory, a living legacy of a love that not even war could destroy. Tears fell uncontrollably, mixed with sweat, blood, and memories. But this time, they weren't just tears of pain, they were tears of love, of relief, of gratitude. Because in the midst of chaos, in the midst of destruction, life had found a way to flourish. She wrapped the baby in a simple blanket, held him close to her chest, and looking up at the sky that was now beginning to lighten, made a silent promise: "I'll protect you, for me, for him, for all three of us." The sound of planes still crossed the sky. The smell of war still lingered in the air. But inside that house, at that precise moment, there was only love. A love that materialized in the warmth of that son's skin, in the sound of his cries, in the strength of his first breath. Sophia knew the days would be difficult, that the village's judgment would come, that many questions would remain unanswered, that perhaps Alexander would never hold that child in his arms. that perhaps he would never know that, even before leaving, he had left a large part of himself in that world, a life, a continuation, a legacy. But at that moment, none of that mattered, because he understood, now more than ever, that life is stubborn, that it persists, that it resists, that even when everything around it seems to be falling apart, it finds a gap, a crack, an opportunity to make itself present. The baby, now asleep on her chest, breathed peacefully, oblivious to the war, oblivious to the chaos. And, looking at him, Sophia knew that, no matter what happened from then on, that love would live forever. In his eyes, in his smile, in her existence, he was the son Alexander never knew existed, but it was also living proof that love, when it's true, can overcome any distance. It can conquer any war, and even survive silence. Time, that same time that so often seemed cruel, began to pass differently. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. And although the pain of Alexander's absence never ceased, it slowly gave way to something new. Something Sophia couldn't name, but which, inside her, grew with the same strength as the love that once united them. The boy grew up, and, from a very young age, he carried in his eyes the reflection of who he was, even without knowing it. He had Alexander's steady, gentle gaze, that gaze that seemed capable of traversing any distance, any time, any pain. And every time Sophia looked at that little being, she felt as if, in some way, she were looking back at Alexander. She called him Nikolai, a powerful name that carried history, meaning, and now the weight of a legacy. A name that would forever be the living memory of a love that war tried to destroy, but failed. Because, even if Alexander never knew it, he had left his seed in the world, an extension of your life, irrefutable proof that, no matter how hard the war tried, love triumphed. Sophia made sure to tell Nikolai, from a very young age, who her father was. Even though her words were accompanied by tears, even though her voice sometimes trembled, she didn't hide the truth from him. He showed her the photos he kept in the old wooden box. He read and reread the letters, yellowed by time. He pointed to the horizon and said, "Your father left for a reason, even he didn't fully understand. But, if there's one thing you need to know, my son, it's that he would love you more than anything in this world. ... if he knew you existed." Nikolai grew up hearing these stories, and although he deeply felt the absence of a father figure, he held a silent pride within him. A pride that was reflected in every gesture, every glance, every step. He knew it was the fruit of a love greater than anything, a love that not even war could erase. The letters Sophia never dared to send became, over time, a kind of sacred reliquary. On Sundays, when the silence of the village grew more burdensome, she would sit with Nikolai by the window and read to him, not only the letters Alexander sent her, but also the ones she wrote herself, but never sent. "Here, son," she said, opening one of the letters, "it's written that, the day I discovered you were here, growing inside me, ... I wanted everyone to know, but, at the same time, ... double quotes." She stopped, swallowing back tears. "I was so afraid, so..." Nikolai, still little, held his mother's hand tightly, as if with that gesture he wanted to say, "It's okay, Mummy, I understand, I feel it here." The town, once filled with whispers and suspicious glances, was also changing. People who had initially judged her slowly began to surrender to the strength she possessed. She wasn't just any woman. She was a woman who, despite being shattered by life, managed to rebuild herself. Despite having lost so much, he chose to love. He chose to continue. She chose to be a mother, even when the world seemed unwilling. And as Nikolai grew, that boy with the intense gaze and shy smile became not only an extension of Alexander and Sophia's love, but also an inspiration to all who knew him. It was impossible to look at him and not feel that there was something special about him, something that transcended his mere existence. Sophia taught him about respect, empathy, and resilience. But above all, she taught him about love, about how love, when it's true, is stronger than any war, any distance, any absence. He taught her that even though her father never held her hand, never whispered her name, never rocked her to sleep, he was there, in every cell, in every smile, in every heartbeat. And many nights, when the sky was clear and the stars shone brightly, Sophia and Nikolai would go out into the fields, lie on the grass, gaze at the sky, and talk silently with Alexander. not with words, but with their hearts. With that conversation that only love understands. Do you think he can hear, Mom? Nikolai asked, his gaze fixed on the stars. I'm sure, my love, she replied, taking his hand. I'm sure he sees you, that he cares for you, and that, wherever he is, he loves you more than anything in this world. Time passed, but love didn't, because there are things that neither time, nor war, nor death can erase. And in that town lost on the map, where a train took a man full of dreams, he was now growing, running, smiling, a new life, a legacy. The son Alexander never knew existed, but that, even so, wasn't always will be his greatest victory. Time has a strange way of playing tricks on us. Sometimes it speeds up, robbing us of what we hold most dear. Other times it drags on, turning the wait into a silent punishment. But every once in a while, time stands still, and when it stops, it reveals secrets that have been hidden for years, or perhaps a lifetime. It was one autumn afternoon, when the wind carried with it the scent of dry leaves and wet earth, that Sophia's life changed again. The routine continued as usual. Nikolai, now a few years old, played in the yard, kicking stones, laughing, without even imagining that, at that very moment, something was about to break the silence that had settled in since the day Alexander left. The sound of approaching cartwheels caught Sophia's attention. She dried her hands on her apron and headed for the door. It was the old village postman, the same one who, years before, had delivered Alexander's letters. Letters that, over time, had become fewer and fewer, until they stopped altogether. Dona Sophia letters, he said in a low voice, almost embarrassed. I found this at the bottom of one of the old suitcases from the station. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it's for you. In his hands was a yellowed envelope, marked by time, stained by moisture, with his name written in a handwriting he knew so well that it immediately made his heart race. For a moment, the whole world fell silent. Everything stopped. The sound of the wind, the footsteps, the leaves, everything disappeared. Only she remained, that envelope, and the irregular beating of her own heart. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter. Her eyes, filled with tears, could no longer contain them. It was his handwriting. It was Alexander's. It was as if he had suddenly returned. As if, through that paper, he had traversed time, distance, and war, and had returned to her. Sophia couldn't wait. She sat on the threshold, took a deep breath, and, with trembling hands, broke the seal. The smell of old paper mingled with the scent of memories. She closed her eyes for a second, as if preparing to hear her loved one's voice after a long silence. The letter began simply, "My love, if you're reading this, it's because, in some way, it touched you. I wrote this letter the day before our last offensive. I don't know what it will be like. I don't know if I'll ever return. But there are things I can't stop telling you." Sophia clutched the paper to her chest, as if she wanted to fuse that letter with her own body, with her own heart. The next words were a mixture of love and despair. She spoke of longing, of how, every night, before closing her eyes, she imagined his face, of how the sound of his voice echoed in her memory, like a song that kept him alive, even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. "If I don't come back, I want you to know that I loved you with all my being, that you were, and always will be, the reason for every beat of my heart, and that, if there's anything that hurts more than facing this war, it's the thought of never seeing you again, of never holding you, of never being able to keep the promise I made you, to come back and rebuild our lives." Sophia's tears were already dampening the paper, slightly staining the ink, but she continued, holding on tightly, like someone clinging to the last bridge that still connects her to her loved one. "If I fall, if for some reason I can't get up, I want you to follow me, no matter how much it hurts, no matter how impossible it seems, because our love doesn't end here. My love, it's bigger than this. It's bigger than war, bigger than death. It lives on. It lives in you. It lives in what we were. It lives in what we dreamed." Sophia closed her eyes tightly. Her hands were shaking so much that for a moment she had to rest the letter on her lap to keep it from falling. She took a deep breath, and then, the last lines, the ones that broke her heart in a way she never imagined possible. "And if, by a miracle, one day life gives you something of mine, if, somehow, there's a little piece of me there with you, you should know that, even without knowing it, I already love that little piece more than anything, because it's part of us, and THAT, something that not even war can erase. Reading these words, Sophia brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob that seemed to rise from the depths of her being. It was as if he knew, as if, in some mysterious way, his heart had sensed that, before leaving, he had left more than memories, he had left life. She looked at Nikolai, who was playing in the yard, oblivious to everything. She saw every feature of Alexander in him, his way of walking, his shy smile, his determined gaze. It was all there, it was all him. Sophia stood up, holding the letter against her chest, approached her son, bent down, held his little face with her hands and, with a broken voice, said, "My love, this is the letter your father wrote to us. To me, ... and, without knowing it, to you too. Because even though that letter had taken an eternity to arrive, even though Alexander had never held that son in his arms, somehow, their love had transcended time, silence, and war. And there, on that yellowed piece of paper, was proof that, even separated by life, by time ... or by death, some loves just ... never end. Time, once again, showed its cruelest face. Because when you wait for someone who may never return, time ceases to be measured and becomes a prison. Days, months, years, everything blurs together. The calendar loses its meaning. The clock becomes a constant reminder that what you most desire ... isn't enough. For Sophia, the wait became a routine, a painful routine, made up of small rituals. Every morning, she opened the window, looked at the horizon, took a deep breath, and, for a few seconds, closed her eyes, as if that might evoke his image, as if, somewhere in the world, Alexander also closed his eyes at that very moment, and, unknowingly, connected with her. The letter, which arrived too late, now rested on the living room table, inside an old wooden frame. Beside it, an old photo, taken on one of those days that seemed ordinary, but then seemed eternal. Sophia would often sit there for long minutes, staring at those words, as if talking to someone who, though absent, was always present. Nikolai grew up, and with him grew the void left by Alexander. Although Sophia had done her best to fill that space with love, affection, and stories, there were times when the boy inevitably stared at the empty door, as if expecting it to open at any moment, and through it walked the man he'd heard so much about, but had never met. "Mum," she asked once, holding one of her father's letters, "why didn't he come back?" Sophia took a deep breath. She swallowed to contain the lump forming in her throat. She had mentally prepared herself for this question many times, but when it finally came, she realized that no amount of preparation was enough, because, he began, trying to choose his words sometimes. "Son, life takes people so far, that they can't go back, but he wanted to come back, didn't he?" she insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "More than anything," he replied, holding his son's face and looking deeply into his eyes. "Your father, he loved you, even without knowing you existed, and, wherever he is now ... I'm sure, he loves you more than anything in this world." Those conversations were repeated, on sunny days, on rainy nights, on silent dawns, when Sophia woke startled by the sound of a dream, or perhaps a memory, and every time she looked at the emptiness of the bed, she felt his absence like a sharp knife that never fully healed. But the cruelest part of waiting wasn't the physical absence, it was the absence of answers. Because, unlike death, which arrives with its brutality and brings, even if wrapped in pain, a certainty, absence without news is a ghost that never leaves. It invades the house, sits at the table, lies in bed, walks beside us, and never, ever says goodbye. Sophia tried for a long time to find answers. She wrote to the army, the city council, distant friends, to anyone who could tell her where Alexander was. If he was alive, if he'd been captured, if he'd fallen in combat. But the answers never came. And little by little, she realized they might never come. Deep down, a part of her refused to accept the worst. Every time she saw a man walking along the dirt road, her heart raced. She ran to the window, squinting, trying to see beyond the dust, beyond the distance, beyond the hope. But invariably, the man disappeared around the bend, and with him, another hope. Some people said, "You have to move on. Sophia, forget him, he's not coming back." But those words never made sense to her, because forgetting isn't an option when love is true, because forgetting, for her, would be like betraying everything they'd experienced, everything they'd dreamed of, everything they'd built, even if it was only for a short time. Waiting then became part of her identity. Now, she was not only Sofia, Nikolai's mother, but also Sofia, the woman he'd been waiting for, the woman who every day looked at the horizon, the line of the paths, and allowed herself to believe that, maybe, one day, who knows, he would appear. And even when time began to leave its mark on her face, on her hair, which now had streaks of silver, hope never completely abandoned her. Because, somewhere inside her, Alexander's voice still whispered, "Wait for me, promise." And she promised, and she kept that promise. Every day, every year, her whole life. Because when love overcomes everything, neither time, nor war, nor absence can kill it. It survives, in memory, in blood, in the eyes of a child, and, above all, in the weight that, although it never ended, never ceased to be loved. Time passed like an inexhaustible river, carrying with it days, seasons, and memories. Nikolai grew up, and although his face bore the features of a father he had never met, he grew up surrounded by love. He grew up listening to stories that, although told with tenderness, were always accompanied by a hint of silence, a void, an absence that not even Sofia's words could fill. As a child, Nikolai accepted the stories. He accepted the version his mother told him, the one that said his father was a good and brave man who went to war and, for some reason, never returned. But as the years passed, that absence became a haunting he could no longer ignore. There were unanswered questions, awkward silences, and, above all, there was a box. That old wooden box his mother kept at the back of the closet, always locked, as if it contained not only memories, but also secrets. Nikolai knew there was something else in that box, something that, somehow, could change everything he knew about himself, about his history, about his father. One afternoon, when he was already 17, something inside him snapped. Life in the village was moving slowly, and Sofia was at the market, tending to the chores that always filled her mornings. Alone at home, Nikolai stared at the closet. The box seemed to be calling to him, as if, somehow, she too had been waiting for this moment. With trembling hands, she opened the closet door and pulled out the box. The creaking of the wood made her heart race. For a moment, she stood still, staring at it, as if she needed to prepare herself for what she was about to discover. She took a deep breath, and then, slowly, she opened it. Inside, he found the letters. Old, yellowed letters, some tear-stained, so he didn't even need to ask who they were from. There were also photos. One in particular was of a young man in uniform, holding a suitcase and smiling at the camera. Although he had never met him, Nikolai knew, deep down in his soul, that it was his father. But it was when she picked up a bundle of letters, tied with a red ribbon, that her chest seemed to shatter into 1,000 pieces. She untied the ribbon, opened the first page, and there it was. "My love, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I need to tell you something that weighs on my heart, ... Nikolai read. He read like someone drinking water after a long thirst. He read every word, every line, and with each sentence, he felt as if the pieces of his story were finally coming together. "There's a life growing inside me, ... A life that's yours, that's ours, ... The impact was so strong that she had to sit down. The world seemed to spin. Tears flowed uncontrollably. Because, until that moment, even though she knew the story, she never imagined that her father had never even known of her existence. The letters continued. There were dozens. Some began and never ended. Others were interrupted by blurred ink mixed with tears. And in each one there were not just words, but fragments of Sofia's soul. Fragments of a woman who, even shattered by absence, never stopped loving, never stopped hoping, never stopped writing, though she never had the courage to send it. Nikolai held one of the letters to his chest, closed his eyes, and, for the first time in his life, felt like he understood who he was. He understood where he was coming from. He truly understood the weight and depth of the love that gave rise to it. When Sofia returned home, she found her son sitting on the floor, surrounded by letters, holding Alexander's photos in his hands, with tears in his eyes, but with a serenity she had never seen in him. For a few seconds, he stood motionless in the doorway. He knew this would happen one day, that at some point, Nikolai would discover not only the truth he had never hidden, but also the truth he had never been able to fully reveal. He looked up, met her gaze, and, in a broken voice, asked, "Why, ... Why did you never know, Mom?" Sophia approached him, bent down, took his face in her hands, as she used to do when he was a child, and answered, with tears flowing freely, because I was afraid, my love, afraid that he'd never know, and afraid that he'd know and never be able to come back. I tried so many times, but I could never send him, and when I thought about sending him, it was too late." He hugged her, tight, as if he didn't want to let go, as if he understood, in that embrace, that love is, in fact, greater than everything, greater than mistakes, greater than silence, greater even than war. "It doesn't matter, Mummy, ... he said, holding her tighter, "because now I know, and knowing changes everything." That day, as the sun set, turning the sky orange and gold, mother and son sat there on the ground, surrounded by memories, letters, stories, and a love that, even through war, time, and absence, lived on. Because in the end, understanding that his father had never known of his existence, didn't despise him. On the contrary, it made Nikolai not just the son of a soldier, but the son of an eternal love. Time, that ancient sculptor of memories, had left its mark on Sophia's face, now covered in silver threads and wrinkles that were not only signs of age, but maps of a life filled with love, hope, and endurance. Nikolai, in turn, was no longer the little boy who ran through the fields asking for his father. Now he was a grown man, shouldering not only the weight of his own life, but also the legacy of a love he had never witnessed, but had always felt beating within him. And it was precisely for this reason that, one day, he woke up with the certainty that something had to be done. Something greater than silence, greater than absence, greater even than the war that once took his father. It was time to close a cycle, to give voice to what, for so long, had been trapped between the lines of unsent letters and unspoken words. "Mum, ... she said, grabbing Sophia's hands. "I want to go to where he was last seen. I want to see that place. I want to understand. I want to, somehow, ... find him." Sophia's tearful eyes shone not with sadness, but with quiet pride. She knew this day would come, and although her heart ached at the thought of her son following the same path as Alexander, she understood that there were things that needed to be done, things that needed to be said, even if the other side never heard them. Nikolai organized everything. He took the letters, the photos, a small piece of the handkerchief his mother had been carrying with her since they said goodbye at the station, and, above all, he wrote something of his own, a letter, not to an unknown soldier, but to the father he'd never met. "Father, I don't know if you hear me. I don't know if, in some way, your soul still walks here, along the paths it once traveled. But I came because I needed to know you, even through the wind, the earth, the silence. Getting there wasn't easy. The war had left deep scars on that land, the marks of bombing, the abandoned trenches, the pieces of rusty barbed wire. Everything was there, like petrified memories of a time when love and hate walked hand in hand." Finding the spot indicated in one of the old letters, a clearing near the front where Alexander had written his last letter, Nikolai stopped. The wind blew hard, shaking the trees. The sky was heavy, as if the world itself understood the gravity of that moment. He knelt down. He opened the box. He took out the photo of his parents, a letter from his mother, the letter he'd written, and with a firm hand, he placed it all there, on a moss-covered stone. Double quotes, "Dad, ... she began, her voice trembling. "I grew up hearing about you. I grew up looking for you in every part of my face, in the sound of my own voice. I grew up looking for you in the stories my mother told, in the letters she wrote, even though I didn't know if you'd ever read them." Tears fell, but this time, they weren't of pain. They were of surrender, of release. "I wanted you to know that even without knowing you, I love you. I love you because, before you existed, you were already a part of me. Because, even though the war took your body, it never managed to take away who you were. It never managed to erase the love that gave you life, and that gave birth to me." He took a small envelope out of his pocket. Inside was a letter, simple, direct, written from a son to a father. He placed it on the rock and secured it with a pebble so the wind wouldn't blow it away. Then he took a deep breath. looked up at the sky, and with tearful eyes whispered, "You never knew I existed, but I always knew you were a part of me." He stood there in silence for long minutes, the sound of the wind, the rustling of the leaves, and that dense, almost sacred silence, which seemed to be both absence and presence. As the sun set, dyeing the sky shades of gold and orange, Nikolai stood up. He wiped his tears, clutched the photo to his chest, and before leaving, he said out loud, so everyone, visible and invisible, could hear, "I honor you, Father, and I carry your name, I carry your story, I carry your love." When she returned to the village, Sophia was waiting for her at the gate. Her eyes were watery, her hands trembling, but her smile, oh, her smile was one of relief, mission accomplished. From someone who knew that, even if Alexander had never returned, he had never stopped being there, in her blood, in her love, in her memory. And that afternoon, mother and son embraced, and they understood, without needing to say a word, that their love, the love that the war tried to separate, had never been defeated. Because sometimes, life's greatest victories are the ones that not even death can steal. If this story moved you, if you believe that true love is stronger than time, distance, and even war, then you need to be part of this mission to keep the memories alive. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your comment below, because every story like this deserves to be told, remembered, and never forgotten.